I'm hearing more and more, maybe it's an echo chamber, that the future is going to be almost all startups. So, building these skills, learning how to use technology, but also learning how to solve problems quickly using technology, which is effectively what a startup is important. I would argue the government needs to start finding a way to work with startups, perhaps even operate as a startup. It feels still too stuffy all across the world. It's too slow.
Government operating as a startup. Absolutely. So we're talking at a time when Elon Musk has been appointed as to run the Department of Government Efficiency, Doge. I'm obsessed, even more obsessed, by how unbelievably out of date government structures are. It just drives me round the bend. We have a Victorian structure in government in the UK, which is mirrored around the world. You have governments working in silos. You have the Department of Business working next to the Department for Foreign Affairs, working next to the Department for Education, working next to the Department of Health. I had a debate today on my radio show where we were discussing whether the Prime Minister should move out of 10 Downing Street, the traditional home of the British Prime Minister, but not just his home, his office. It's completely unfit for purpose. And both the last Labour government, i.e. Tony Blair's government, and the David Cameron government both debated how to organise government physically, how to put what buildings. And at one point there was even talk of putting all government ministers in the same building, sitting in an open plan office where they could all interact with each other. And government in silos is well past its sell-by date. We should abolish every single government department. And we should set the government missions which it can achieve. And you shouldn't have the Department of Economic Growth, but you should have the mission for economic growth, and then unpack that. What does that mean? You should have the mission for digital government, but everything should be digital. I mean, I discovered when I was the Minister for Broadband that the Department of Transport spent £1 billion upgrading its signal network using full fibre. If they'd talked to me 4 years before, they were effectively building a backbone fibre network. They were going to use about 1% of it for signalling, which could have been the communications hub of the country. But instead, it's a massively underused fibre network for the railway system. There's no joining up in government. And so government as a startup is about being nimble and flexible and fast. And also, the other key point about a startup is government should be allowed to fail. Startups fail and people say, we tried that, move on.
In Youth We Trust sits down with successful entrepreneurs, business leaders, educators, and others from around the world. We spotlight how individuals and organizations are shaping a better world, directly or indirectly, for the coming generations through their focus on sustainability, equity, education, and more to empower young people to create the future they deserve. And now, in Youth We Trust.
Lord Ed Vaizey, welcome to the podcast in Youth We Trust.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, it's such a joy. As I was saying a moment ago, this is a little bit of a role reversal. I'm talking to a consummate broadcaster, podcaster, and media personality. And here we are. I'm putting you in the hot seat this time. And I'm going to actually take you through a journey where we'll talk about all things youth, business, and AI.
Great. No, I'm looking forward to it.
Brilliant. So, Ed, as you know, Lumi is about building the next generation into a generation that is AI ready, that is ready for the future. But we are increasingly also focused on today's workforce, which is ready for the disruption that AI will bring. In a way, we are trying to see how AI will shape society and how can we prepare humanity for it in a very small and humble way. But the difference is we focus on solving real problems as opposed to any kind of theoretical learning. So, what I want to understand from you is if I take you all the way back to when you were at school or university, were there any problems around you that you thought you really wanted to solve?
No, I can't think of any particular problems that I wanted to solve. I mean, school for me was a very linear process. It was focused on getting great exam grades, getting into the best university, and then going on and living your life. And I think, I was at one of the best schools in England called St. Paul's. I'm lucky enough to be a governor there now, and I'm lucky enough that one of my children attends that school. And I have to say that his education is not that different from my education, which is perhaps a challenge for St. Paul's in 2024, but that's a whole other topic. I think that for me, what distinguishes British education, English, Scottish, Welsh education, however you want to describe it, is that at the best schools, there is a strong emphasis on the ability to solve problems and think for yourself. So obviously, St. Paul's as an elite school is with very highly qualified teachers and highly intelligent pupils because they have to pass a competitive exam to get into the school. You tend to get a group of children who are fairly self-confident and who therefore are taught from an early age to challenge the opinions that they hear, even from their teachers and in the world around them, and to question them and to think for themselves, and also to be taught from an early stage that their opinions are as valid as anybody else's. So, uh, I mean, when you say, was there a problem I wanted to solve? I think, uh, I guess the thought it would provoke is that I was very political from a very young age. I grew up in a political family. My father was very involved in politics, and I was growing up at a time when Margaret Thatcher was coming to power in the UK, and therefore the problem that needed solving at the time was what was called the British disease: low productivity, very powerful trade unions, a stagnant economy, crumbling public infrastructure. I'm happy to say that Margaret Thatcher didn't wait around for me to grow up and become a member of parliament. She solved a lot of those problems, not without causing some pain, which still lingers in the UK. So that was what dominated the agenda when I was growing up and when I was at university. Obviously, Margaret Thatcher was a very controversial prime minister and was controversial when I was at university, but those are the problems that she set about trying to solve, and that's kind of what brought me into politics. I was very involved, as I say, partly because my father was involved. So I was very engaged and interested. I did a lot of debating at school. That was one of the things I was good at, and I think that the problem that I've always tried to solve ever since is to make the UK one of the best places in the world to live, to ensure that we have a stable economy, the rule of law, property rights, but that people have freedom to pursue their passions and interests with the minimum interference from the state. And it's a constant battle. We've got a new government, it's a Labour government that to a certain extent has returned to traditional Labour policies of raising taxes and increasing public spending. And those problems never go away. So it's a good example of why history is important, because everything we see around us in the world today, whether it's tensions between the great powers or the rise of populism, economic instability, overweening government, they're problems that we've been discussing really since the modern world began.
Such a true point. Now, you've given me a lot of fodder here. Now, as we prepare for what's coming down our way, uh, how important is it that this change happens, and who's going to bring that change? Do you think government can bring this change, or do you think it has to come from somewhere else, including startups working with these schools?
Yeah, I think it's a really tough question because getting from A to B is so very difficult. And also, while I have a sense of what B is, I'm not entirely sure what it is. I just kind of know that the education system is stuck. Uh, but I'll have to think aloud on this one, so bear with me. I think that on the one hand, the education system isn't stuck. There's no substitute, it seems to me, from teaching the basics. I mean, what does anyone need, as it were, to navigate the world? You need to be able to read and write, to be articulate, and to be numerate. And arguably, you may also need to be familiar with coding, but some people would dispute that. So getting the basics right is very important. And I think we saw in the UK under Michael Gove when he was Education Secretary, and for those who aren't familiar with British politics, he was Education Secretary between 2010 and 2013, 2014. And there was a big emphasis from him and his team on raising literacy rates in British schools, and their hard work has paid off in terms of the international PISA ratings that are the kind of respected ratings to kind of gauge how well individual countries do in terms of literacy. Britain has risen up the league tables, but it's not as good at maths as other countries. So getting the basics right is absolutely essential. But I think what is missing, so in that sense, a traditional education is important. And, all the kids at St. Paul's now, many, many more of them do maths till they leave school, and very advanced maths. They're very good at science. And again, studying physics, biology, chemistry, all essential building blocks to help you take part in the modern world, and all with up-to-date curriculums. And then there are the humanities, the tradition of writing essays, giving you the skills of analysis, and the ability to write and communicate, which is still needed, are all there. And I guess I would say that what is missing from education are two things. One is what have traditionally been regarded as kind of frivolous subjects, perhaps, but I think are important. So one of the most important issues facing any developed nation at the moment is the health of their population. So while life expectancy has increased, we're eating badly, and what used to be called home economics, learning to cook, there's a complete absence in schools of kind of teaching kids the basics about nutrition and health, which I think is really important. But obviously the big gap for me, and this is the B part, and this is the how do you get from A to B part, which is so difficult, is how do you use technology to kind of transform the education experience of kids? And there are kind of 2 points that flow from that. The first is screens. We spend our life obviously worrying about our kids on phones and their screen time, and that they're doom scrolling through TikTok videos. But we have to accept, just as you and I are addicted to our phones, that the screen is now the main medium for communication. And I was talking to somebody in one of the social media companies earlier on my Times radio show, and they were saying, oh, we give parents advice on how to engage with their kids on how they use social media. Well, my engagement with my kids is, I tell them to get off their phone, and they say, well, why should we? Because you're on your phone. So we're all on our phones. And we also have to accept that, when I was a kid, I spent hours on the telephone, the landline, speaking to my friends. We have to accept that communication tools often change the way you communicate and how you exchange ideas. And my kids may not see their friends physically as much as I saw my friends physically when I was growing up, but they communicate while they play games, they communicate by sharing TikTok videos, they get a lot of their information and their news from TikTok. The private sector steps in to do that job. Different news companies have sprung up to provide news in bite-sized chunks. And I don't get over-exercised by, the collapse of the attention span or whatever, or that kids aren't reading books. Books are a medium of communication. TikTok is a medium of communication. They're both art forms in their different ways. So I think we should accept the screen as the medium of communication. But I also think we should explore with technologists and technology companies how you can personalize education. Again, on my Times radio show, I had an interesting discussion with a guy who started a company called Crimson Education. And he started it because he found from his obscure school in New Zealand, he got accepted into 25 US universities. And he set up a company to teach kids how to get accepted at the most elite universities, and basically the tricks of the trade. But underneath that is an interesting truth that he's sort of unwittingly uncovered. I'm not sure he's completely alive to the fact that he's uncovered it, which is how do you ignite a kid's passion? And he's set up a virtual school. He has 2,000 students. They learn online. They learn within an international community. They're not confined to the geography of their home or their neighborhood. But for me, he had this kind of really telling point. How do you ignite a passion? How do you get we all know successful people, we often meet successful people who are successful by accident. Sometimes they're successful because they literally had no prospects. So they took a dead end job somewhere, suddenly found they were good in it and rose to the top of their business and became a hugely successful entrepreneur. But others often credit their success with a particular teacher who randomly ignited their passion. They just happened to have a brilliant English teacher or a brilliant math teacher. Um, I was speaking to an MP earlier today who said that one of the things that's interesting about his constituency is that the same high school produced two Nobel Prize winners in science, both of whom were taught by the same science teacher. That science teacher sounds to me like he could ignite a passion. So how do you use technology to personalize learning? How do you use technology to take someone who's not inspired by maths, show them where their strengths are, show them where they need to do a bit more work, make it exciting and engaging and interesting? And how do you use technology to uncover from that person who may not end up being a maths student or brilliant at maths? How do you engage them and find out what their passion is and then double down on it? And I think that's the missing ingredient at the moment in education. But I also acknowledge that to a certain extent, I'm talking at a high level of ignorance. If there was a teacher on the school, as often happened to me when I was an MP and I kind of sounded off with very little knowledge, I'd immediately get emails and letters and texts saying, you don't know what you're talking about. We're already doing all the stuff you're complaining about isn't happening. We're already doing it. It may well be happening in some schools, but that to me is the missing ingredient in education.
Yeah, well, I've been particularly close to the sector, and I can, it doesn't matter who says what. I don't personally believe that is it's happening or it's happening effectively with a clear structure. I think devices were introduced into schools when my daughter was growing up, and I think that could have been done better. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. Screens and phones and all these things have become inevitable part of our existence. The point I actually wanted to just probe on is where I find lack of change is it's not possible for the government to do everything or actually perhaps even do anything in the education sector. But I don't see how this sector can change because neither is the government doing anything substantial, nor is the curriculum changing, nor is is the curriculum becoming a little bit more relaxed to allow innovation to kind of go in and make substantial change. So how do you see that changing?
Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? How do you do this kind of cross-curricular working? How do you, um, the thoughtful people I've talked to in education do make this point, which is, are subject silos still fit for purpose? I talked earlier about
I was going to say that.
uh, giving kids the basic building blocks, and there's still a huge amount of merit in that. You need to be able to multiply and subtract and divide and do quadratic equations maybe, and you need to uh, know chemical symbols and understand how chemicals work, for example, in all sorts of different jobs, and you need those basic building blocks. But there's also the argument that says, you know, so many of these subjects interleave and problem solve. If you're building a bridge, you need to know about maths. You need to know potentially geography. Where are you going to build this bridge? You need to know about communities and geography. Where are you going to know human geography? Where is the right place to build this bridge? You need to know about materials science. You need to know a bit about design and art in order to make your bridge look beautiful. So there are all sorts of ways that subjects intersect, and uh, there are all sorts of attractions in giving kids problems to solve and then unpicking how they solved it and explaining why these different subjects are so important. But I mean, the other point, talking about technology, I have a friend, Ian Livingston, who's widely regarded as the sort of godfather of the games industry in the UK. He set up a school in Bournemouth because he wants to test his theories. It sounds like he's using the kids as lab rats, but he's not. They'll get a great education come what may. But he's obsessed by the gamification of learning, by which he means, obviously, all of us know that our kids spend hours, particularly our boys, spend hours video gaming, and I have no problem with that. I was the minister for video games. It's a fantastic industry. If my kids ended up working in it, I'd be proud as punch. But what is it about games that engages them so much? It's the competitive element, it's the social element, it's the interactivity element, but their learning isn't like that.
No,
In the
it is
best
not at all.
schools,
Yeah.
it's a bit like that because you've got small class sizes, intelligent teachers who treat them like adults and engage them in debate. But it's still a teacher behind a desk talking to a group of kids. And we should be using the incredible minds that create these incredible video games to think about how we create really engaging content for kids to help them learn. When you think about the Oculus and the Apple face mask, and the kind of things you can witness on that in terms of interacting with dinosaurs to watching a human baby growing in the womb, think how much more compelling and engaging that content is than a textbook in terms of learning how these things work and happen. So gamification, visual stimulation, interactivity, screens, they're all there waiting to be kind of fully integrated into how you educate children.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think um, the thing that I'd noticed, Lumi has actually been that intervention in many schools across the world, including some of the best schools in the UK, where we started to bring in this interdisciplinary aspect to learning. It's all about solving the biggest problems, in fact, the biggest problems like climate. But I have to admit, we ended up in many cases becoming a privileged extracurricular activity because the point was lost and we could not be fitted into a curriculum that refuses to change, which took me to the Ministry of Education only to be told that they are so decentralized that they can't make any change. So I felt like this isn't on, here I am, one of many entrepreneurs who's trying to change things, having spent nearly 60% of my 25-year career in education, yet we can't make a change. And this is not just the UK, Ed, this is actually happening all over the world. So what I'm actually trying to understand is, from someone who has a perspective like you, and if the government is listening, what could it be possibly doing? Because I personally don't think we have that much time with AI at our doorstep.
Well, I think there is so much in that question. So first of all, it is true that we have a decentralized education system in England. We don't in Scotland and Wales, but the virtue of the decentralized education in England is that to a certain extent, schools or chains of schools known as multi-academy trusts have the opportunity to innovate within their schools and teach in a different way. So I have some sympathy with the argument that says that government doesn't actually change these things. It's inspiring and innovative teachers. So let me try and unpack that in several different ways. First of all, government has a role because it sets the exam framework. And we can debate, for example, uh, whether exams are fit for purpose. It's one snapshot of kids learning and, frankly, an ability to take an exam and an ability to retain facts. For example, it is widely known that the biology GCSE, in order to get a 9, you have to answer the questions in a certain way, and the examiner is looking for specific answers. They're not looking for thinking or originality. So how do you reform the exam system using technology? Do you have exams, or do you have continuous assessment where technology is able to genuinely gauge your ability? I think that is a really interesting debate to have. Your problem solving ability in a field like biology or chemistry, with kind of real time assessment of your ability in that subject. Technology must be able to do something like that. The government also has a role in it sets the national curriculum, so it decides what subjects kids should learn. And again, it could dictate what books kids study. And there's a big argument from a lot of English teachers, which I sympathise with, which we still insist that kids read Victorian authors instead of contemporary authors, which puts them off reading and so on. So the government could step back a bit from the national curriculum and give schools more flexibility. But ultimately, for me, it relies on inspiring heads who are willing to take risks with the curriculum and with teaching methods and an inspiring group of teachers, but they're still constrained because they could teach the most fantastic and inspiring curriculum on earth. But if as a result all their kids fail their GCSEs because it's not fit for the GCSE, they're not going to come out of it very well. So uh, government does have a role, I think. It sets the tone and it sets the agenda, not in teaching methods, but certainly in terms of what the curriculum is and how kids are measured, how their success at school is measured. Government completely controls that, and that's where some of the thinking should happen. I mean, your point about AI obviously opens up a whole new sphere of discussion, and I'm relaxed about AI in the sense that, again, as I was saying earlier about screens, it's here, it's staying, it's not going away. The best AI is going to be a fantastic tool and an enabler. And like any new technology, we have to be alive to the potential dangers that AI will bring. But AI could potentially be a fantastic resource as a teaching assistant and as a way of assisting learning in schools.
This episode is brought to you by Lumi.network. We're on a mission to help the next generation prepare to take on the world. Our AI-augmented platform runs quests that help 10 to 25-year-olds shape their future by developing AI, entrepreneurship, and design thinking skills to solve the most pressing business and social issues. If you or your organization wants to impact the next generation positively, we'd love to talk to you. To learn more, visit Lumi.network.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about schools, whereas I'm increasingly finding myself discussing the topic of the world of work and UK productivity. I mean, you made a very, very good point that you grew up in an era where there was a British disease of low productivity. Now we are entering an era where UK productivity actually trails um, the US quite significantly, and AI is that one tool that could make all the difference. So we are dealing with, on the one hand, schools have a role to play, but when people are getting into university or getting into work, it's becoming even more important that they are much more AI literate. So I'm again and again going back to the government with you, because you've held so many different roles within the government. Now what? you know Now, do we take a role of regulating AI, or do we take the role of letting it be and letting it find its own course so that the UK productivity can really get the true benefit of this technology?
Well, there are so many different levels to this. Brussels has regulated AI. The new government in Britain is talking about an AI regulation tool, and it's all focused on safety. And there are all sorts of complicated issues to do with AI, copyright, attribution, royalties, what you feed into the LLM, bias in its answers, but also what you're talking about to a certain extent in AI literacy is about people being alive to these dangers that we know, for example, that primitive AI, and we're living in the era of primitive AI, it's taking off very, very quickly, but we're not yet at the killer robot stage. We know that AI comes up with phantom answers, phantom sources. So people have to be intelligent enough or educated enough or alive enough to realize that when they type a question into an AI search engine and they get a particular answer, it may not be definitive. And so those critical skills are important. But that's a really interesting point. So, and it's interesting both the schools and the workplace. So, there is this tradition with any new technology to say, well, here comes technology, it's going to completely destroy jobs. I completely disagree with that analysis. I think it will create jobs and better jobs in many ways. But let's take schools. There's a huge marketplace for the accreditation of AI tools in schools to make sure that the AI that's being used by schools is accredited by a government-sponsored body in terms of, is it fit for purpose on multiple different levels in how it's used in the curriculum. There's a huge marketplace, and we haven't talked about teacher training because this is, again, why it takes so long to change schools, because if you go into education at 23 and you leave at 65, you've got 40 years of teaching, and it's going to be hard to teach an old dog new tricks when you're kind of in your mid 40s and you've taught in a certain way for 20 years. Um, but we have to find a way to engage our teachers in AI and show them the benefits. And in some ways, they will be self-taught. There are now obviously multiple websites where teachers go and kind of have peer-to-peer learning. But perhaps there has to be a more formal mechanism. And this goes back to how frustrated you found yourself with the Department for Education wanting to kind of change teaching methods, that there may have to be a more formal process to get schools to engage in a sort of basic AI literacy program for teachers. This is the best way to use AI. This is the way to be alive to the dangers of AI. This is how a maths teacher can use AI to enhance their lessons. This is how a chemistry teacher can use AI. And similarly, in the world of work, there's now presumably a huge marketplace for companies to assist businesses with using AI to increase their productivity. And we know that AI can increase productivity because we know that, for example, even in the most basic service, customer service, you can use AI bots to deal with 90% of the queries from your customers. And that's got to be a good thing. That doesn't mean that call centers are going to go out of business. It means that you're going to get more happy customers who love your service because they could deal with a problem very, very quickly. But you'll also have very trained experts working in your company who can either advise your customers on their more complex problems or even get into giving them proactive advice in terms of how they interact with your company. So the possibilities are endless, and it will create, I think, a huge marketplace will be created to upskill businesses in how they can use AI.
Yeah, and see, another part where you have been quite prolific um, is the world of startups. So, again, in my opinion, when I look at some very successful entrepreneurs around the world, I'm hearing more and more, maybe it's an echo chamber, that the future is going to be almost all startups. So, building these skills, learning how to use technology, but also learning how to solve problems quickly using technology, which is effectively what a startup is important. I would argue the government starts needs to start finding a way to work with startups, perhaps even operate as a startup. It feels still too stuffy all across the world. It's too slow.
Government operating as a startup. Absolutely. So we're talking at a time when Elon Musk has been appointed as to run the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. He's not actually going to have a government department, and he's not going to be employed by the government. He's going to give advice from the outside about how to save money. But this is interesting because it's actually a different debate to the debate we've just been having about schools, because and I know more about government than I do about schools. I'm obsessed, even more obsessed, by how unbelievably out of date government structures are. It just drives me round the bend. We have a Victorian structure in government in the UK, which is mirrored around the world. You have governments working in silos. You have the Department of Business working next to the Department for Foreign Affairs, working next to the Department for Education, working next to the Department of Health. Um, I had a debate today on my radio show where we were discussing whether the Prime Minister should move out of 10 Downing Street, the traditional home of the British Prime Minister, but not just his home, his office. It's completely unfit for purpose. And both the last Labour government, i.e. Tony Blair's government, and the David Cameron government both debated how to organise government physically, how to put what buildings. And at one point, there was even talk of putting all government ministers in the same building, sitting in an open plan office where they could all interact with each other. And government in silos is well past its sell by date. We should abolish every single government department.
I
And we
so
should set the government missions which it can achieve. And you shouldn't have the Department of Economic Growth, but you should have the mission for economic growth and then unpack that. What does that mean? You should have the mission for digital government, but everything should be digital. What does that mean? You should have the mission for ensuring that no baby dies in childbirth. What does that mean? That means health, education, nutrition, all sorts of things. You should have the mission for longevity. That's about health, but it's also about culture and the arts. It's about clean air, all sorts of things. So going right back to what we talked about, lessons in silos, and how you can set kids a task and show how 7 or 8 different subject matters come to bear on that task. Government should understand it has tasks to achieve for the country, and uh, it should carry them out. I mean, I discovered when I was the Minister for Broadband that the Department of Transport had spent £1 billion upgrading its signal network using full fibre. If they had talked to me 4 years before, they were effectively building a backbone fibre network. They were going to use about 1% of it for signalling, which could have been the communications hub of the country. But instead, it's a massively underused fibre network for the railway system. There's no joining up in government. And so government as a startup is about being nimble and flexible and fast. And also, the other key point about a startup is government should be allowed to fail. Startups fail, and people say, we tried that, move on. Governments fail, it's you've wasted taxpayers' money, you didn't plan it properly, you're outrageous. There are just so many different ways. The one thing we discovered when we were very successful in the 2010s at digitizing government. Really boring things like taking away the paper tax disc that sits in the windscreen of your car. So it's now online, and traffic wardens can just, check index numbers and see if you've got an up-to-date tax disc. We learned that the key about digitization, which is why it's so important, and which is why it goes to kind of breaking down government departments, is it's about reimagining processes. And so when you look at the Ministry of Justice and you realize that somebody who gets in the criminal justice system from the moment they're charged to the moment they're released from prison kind of gets 5 or 6 different identification numbers along the way. So there's no joining up. It should be a seamless system, and if there's anything that cries out for being a mission, it's criminal justice. It's about education in schools, identifying kids early who might go off the rails. It's about nutrition. It's about health. It's about job opportunities. It's about education. It's about what you do with people when they're in prison or when they're in the criminal justice system. So by digitizing government, you can also reimagine how government processes work and make them much more seamless and integrated.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, look, my singular thought when I heard about Musk being appointed was the very next thing the thought was this is going to be very disruptive. Of course, a little bit biased perhaps, but at the same time, one of the things that they might abolish is the Department for Education. That's amongst many other things. So if you have been very persuasive. You managed to convince um, the Star Wars to be shot in the UK. You've managed to get coding into the curriculum. So Ed, how do people like you or entrepreneurs like us actually make a change today? How?
Well, it's a combination of factors. First of all, you need personal relationships. They count. So one of the things that changes what you can do is knowing someone well enough to be able to have frank conversations with them. And one of the virtues of politics, in some ways, certainly in British politics, is that you do grow up together. Now, some people think that's outrageous. It's exclusive. It's an establishment stitch up, but from quite a young age, if politics is a long game. It's difficult to become an elected politician. So you will know in your early 20s, you'll start meeting people, if you're interested in politics, who will probably end up in government with you 20 years later. So personal relationships actually count for a lot. It's about trust as well. It's also about moments in time. One of the reasons that the Prime Minister might move out of Downing Street is the same reason we might have to move out of Parliament, because it may fall down at any moment. And we may not decide to build a new parliamentary building until it literally falls down around our ears. But that will be a moment in time when we'll have to make a decision. And there come moments in time, like in 1979 when Margaret Thatcher got elected, when the country was just fed up and needed a change and was ready for some strong medicine. So, and I think we're getting there with public services. I think we're getting there with hospitals and health and education, where people are so used to, broadly speaking, getting a seamless service from the private sector that they want it from the public sector. People are entitled to ask, why can I not go and see a doctor, get a diagnosis, get treatment, and be dealt with? Why are these, So there's a moment in time, I think, where the public services have run out of road, where you just cannot simply say it's because they don't have enough money. There's something fundamentally wrong with the process. But what I'm saying in a very long-winded way is there comes a point where you really cannot keep flogging the same dead horse. You've got it by necessity. By necessity, you have to think differently. And that is your moment, Prashant. That's the entrepreneur's moment to say, you can do this differently. Let me show you how. And for me, for example, I think the private sector is filling the gap. I think I may have told you the story when we first met of signing up for Daniel Eck's new Eck from Spotify's new healthcare company. He's setting up these clinics in London. And for £400, which is a significant sum of money, but certainly within the grasp of most people, he will give you a full body scan and a diagnosis. And there's a 30,000 person waiting list. People are voting with their feet. And I'm amazed that Tesco and Sainsbury's and all the big supermarkets haven't graduated to walk-in health centres where you can get most of what you need diagnosed. I'm amazed that they haven't gone in for routine operations where you can get a cataract operation for £500 or a knee replacement for £2,000, where they haven't commoditized most of the basic treatments that would deal with probably 80% of health waiting lists.
Such an interesting point. I think, I'm conscious of the time. It's this kind of disruptive thinking. I think also personal relationships, perseverance, but also I think just on perseverance, waiting for the right time. If there's one thing I've learned in my career is timing is everything, Ed. I think we're getting
Timing
to
is
that
everything.
point where the level of disruption that we're going to face in a positive way, I think, just like you've taken a positive look at just about everything other than bureaucracy, the force will be so strong that you just cannot avoid it. And my last question to you is, if I fast forward 20 years, do you even see the concept of nations being relevant? I know we are all wedded to the idea of a school, university, job, this, that, etc. in society, but technology is redefining boundaries completely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we forget technology is a tool of communication, and big technology has changed things. The printing press changed things. Electricity changed things. The railways changed things. The telephone changed things. The jet engine changed things. Of course, technology is going to massively disrupt and change things, and we cannot carry on as normal. We learned in Britain a couple of weeks ago there's still a railway company using a fax machine because it can't change its agreement with the unions. You have to embrace this technology. But the key point, there are 2 or 3 key points that come out of this. Well, there's 2 key points in my view, and you've just touched on one of them. The moment in time point. There has to be a moment in time when people are ready for this, and they know they can't do the old ways, so they have to look to the new ways. And the second key point is it's not about the technology, it's about how you use it. So you have to understand that you do not succeed if you just layer the technology on top of your existing processes. You have to fundamentally reimagine how you go about your business if you're going to really get the advantage of technology.
Yeah, and the third thing I think probably we're talking about is pace. That when that moment in time arrives, you have to keep your powder dry and actually just be able to execute at pace. That is really where I am trying to make a small contribution. But I've so enjoyed talking to you, Ed. I mean, I've obviously listened to your show, Times Radio. I've heard you speak in the Parliament. What I find very refreshing about listening to you is you're always straight to the point. I really, really enjoy it. And I think that's what I'd like to see a little bit more.
Thanks for listening. If you found this conversation valuable, please leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you have a story or someone you know does, Please recommend them to us by email at hello@lumi.network. We'll see you next time on In Youth We Trust.